Good morning, everyone. Monsieur le Ministre, gerbiamas viceministre, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear students. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this conference on the future of Europe, and I'm happy to see so many students despite bad weather, COVID restrictions, and the fact that it's 9 o'clock in the morning and Friday. So it just shows the interest in Europe, which is very strong in Lithuania. In fact, for a number of years, Lithuanians have been the most pro-European country in the European Union. The membership in the European Union was one of the major victories throughout our history. So it is not surprising that there is the need to know where the European Union is heading to. And this conference is a part of a number of events on a number of platforms, which is called Conference of the Future of Europe. And the idea of this conference is to involve the society, a number of various groups in the European Union countries in the discussion what kind of Europe we would like to see in the future. In a number of areas: climate change, health, economy, education. So I assume that today's discussion will be about a lot of areas, so don't hesitate to pose a question coming from whatever area. No question is stupid. And in this discussion, in this conference, we have two wonderful speakers. I would say the most appropriate speakers for the discussion like that. Mr. Clément Beaune, who is the Minister of European Affairs, France. And as far as I know, he's been extensively traveling recently to various European countries, talking about Europe. So if you would go to UK, you would see the press and you would see a picture of Mr. Beaune talking about the European things, and if you go to other countries as well. So it could be Mr. Europe in Europe. And of course, everyone knows Arnoldo Pranckevičiaus, who is Mr. Europe in Lithuania. He's been head of the EU delegation for a number of years here in Lithuania, the most proactive pro-European citizen in Lithuania. Now he's become vice minister, and he's doing a good job for Europe already as a part of our government. And an interesting fact that both speakers went to the same school, Sciences Po, the best school of political science in France, one of the best in Europe, and a similar school like the SPMI, Institute of International Relations and Political Science, that you are studying. And today we have students of our institute, SPMI, to participate in the conference, but also the students from Sciences Po will be joining us virtually and also posing the questions and participating virtually. So, without further ado, I'd like to start the conference. And I'd like to ask the first kick-off question, and then later I'll give the floor for your questions. So the question would be dedicated to both of the speakers, and it's very simple. So how would you envisage the future of Europe? I know that there was the data released by the Eurobarometer quite recently, which reveals the feelings and attitudes of the European society towards the conference on the future of Europe, towards the future of Europe. How do they feel, where they want to go? So one of the issues that struck me that in almost all countries, they believe that they would like to vote on European affairs. They want to participate in European affairs. So what is your vision? Where Europe is heading? 5 years, 10 years? Is it federation, confederation, back to member states, Europe of regions? And I would like to start with our guest, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much for this event and to organize it so quickly. I'm very happy to be here. It feels good to be in a physical meeting. It's starting to happen more and more, but I think we need also these discussions and these contacts, even if I think that some students are also joining us online. And I'm very happy, Arnoldo, and I'm very happy to be with you, to be here today, and to take part with you in this debate on the future of Europe, because this event this morning, and thank you for waking up early for this discussion, is a part of a broader initiative that we both supported, that all member states are now implementing, which is to kind of open the doors, open the windows, to have a debate in the coming months, starting already last May, on the future of Europe. We would probably go back to a lot of topics, so maybe just a few words on this extremely broad issue and question. I just want to say I'm optimistic about the future of Europe, to be direct. You might say it's my job, but it's also my job because I believe in it. And look at what has happened during the last 18, 20 months. We had, and we are still to some extent, facing a crisis, which is incredible. It was unpredictable. If we had said to each other a few months ago that we would have to wear masks, to close a lot of activities, to invent a vaccine in a few months to fight a virus, and all this that we all know in our everyday lives, it would have been crazy. If with Arnoldo we would have discussed the big challenges of Europe 2 years ago, 18 months ago, health would never have been a hot topic and a priority on the European agenda. And now we see that we need to do a lot of things at the European level on this overall health issue. But also look at how European countries and the EU have reacted to this crisis. I think everything is far from perfect, but we should be proud. Probably for two reasons which make me optimistic about the future, I would say. First, I think we saw that there is a European, I'm not saying an EU, but more culturally, politically, a European model, a European way to fight the virus, to respond to the crisis. We have been struck by this incredible pandemic, and yet we have preserved and we have defended our way of life, our model. In all EU countries, we have kept an open democratic debate, even when we had to take all governments, and it was not really a pleasure to take measures of restrictions to restrict everyday life freedoms. Our parliaments, our legal system, were checking, were debating all these restrictions. We had protests here in France, we still have sometimes violence, which is not acceptable in a democratic context, but if we exclude this, we had hot debates, which is normal. I mean, look at what happens in some other parts of the world, in Asia, for instance. It was not a kind of fully democratic response to the crisis. And we also displayed and showed a lot of solidarity within our countries, within our societies. Everywhere in Europe, with different technicalities, we supported jobs, we supported small businesses, we supported cafes, restaurants, economic activity. We supported people facing the crisis so that they don't lose money, a job, and so on. And it was also very specific to European countries. And we also showed a lot of solidarity together. And this was not, again, a given. And we had difficult moments because it was a test for European solidarity, it was a test for European action. At the very beginning of the crisis, we saw everywhere in Europe some border closures, some tensions between member states. But after a few days, sometimes weeks of shock, we managed to find a common way to face this crisis. On economic response, I think of the recovery plan, which I think is a huge European success. We created this crazy system of common debt, crazy in a positive manner, and nobody would have imagined this. And we had tense debates also between EU member states. I remember between France and Germany at the beginning, and then we found an agreement, we found a compromise, we found a 27 member state agreement summer 2020, and now we are implementing. Lithuania and France have got the first euros from this, or millions of euros, sometimes billions of euros from this recovery plan. It is helping us rebuilding our economies, rebuilding our societies, investing in digital and green transformations for the years to come. It is very concrete. And even look, I will not insist on all examples, but even look at the health issue itself. We had pretty much nothing at the EU level when we started the crisis. We had a few agencies at the EU level, but of course we had never planned such a crisis. And in a few months, here again, we managed and we decided, I think it was a bold decision, but a very positive decision, to buy together, for instance, our vaccines. Imagine what would have happened without this EU framework, this EU decision. Probably, I don't know who or where, but some member states, probably a majority of member states, would have no vaccine or very few doses because there would have been an internal competition. All member states would have called big pharmas, laboratories to buy their doses and to make sure that they would have more than their neighbor and so on. We did not do that. We had an EU framework, we bought pro rata of the population, doses of vaccines. We have different rates of vaccination in the EU, but very limited gaps and differences in comparison with international benchmarks. And a very, very active and speedy recovery campaign, vaccination campaign, in all our EU member states. The figures are very positive here, they are positive now in France. This is also an EU success. Look at what happens in the rest of the world and imagine what would have happened without EU solidarity on this matter. Which demonstrates that the EU is able to respond when there is political will and political support to crisis, huge crisis, and we did not lack crisis in the last decade. Migration, you are facing it in a different manner again now. Brexit, financial crisis before, economic and health crisis now. We managed to stay together, even to deepen our project on integration. What is more difficult in the EU, and this is also your generation's challenge, is when there is not an emergency, not a sense of urgency, not a crisis, to implement and to show ambition for the future. We have to be able to be ambitious even when there is no immediate need for EU response. What we have been able to do with the economic response to the crisis, with the health and the vaccine action, we need to do it for the digital transformation, for the social agenda, for the climate transition. And I think that your generation is pushing in this direction. When you look at what happened in the last European elections, for instance, it was true in France, it was true in a huge majority of EU countries. Everybody was saying European elections, nobody cares, and so on. The turnout increased. It's still quite low, I must admit, but it's increasing, and especially because the younger generation voted more. So when something is at stake, when we think that Europe can be relevant, can add value, and I think we should be convinced that this is the case for climate, this is the case for protecting our values, for protecting ourselves from external threats, and this is a very topical issue, and in Lithuania you know that it is concrete, it's not abstract. Europe can be there, and then we can discuss the legislation, we can discuss the type of initiative, we can discuss the technical stuff. But I think there is this ability that was demonstrated during the crisis to be stronger on the future. I can mention a few challenges, but I will leave that to the discussion. I think the three I very briefly mentioned 1 minute ago about climate, about digital, how we make sure that Europe is both innovative and inventing a type of regulation which makes this digital transformation relevant for all, so that we don't have only American players or huge players killing innovation in our countries. And the social agenda I was mentioning is also very important, because we saw during the crisis that the European model is about solidarity, and we need to invent also a new form of social model in the years to come, how we protect platform workers in the digital sector, for instance, how we make sure that after the crisis, for the younger generation, We offer support, financial support, legal support, to make sure that they have the right protection in the labor market. All these will be important European challenges. And I will just finish on the value issue, because I think it's so important. We thought that European integration, that joining the club, created a kind of automatic path towards more rights, more freedoms, shared values. And I think it's still there, and it's still very strong. But we also see that in some EU countries, included, not to mention outside the EU, we need to fight, and you will need to fight, always, to protect these values, to have more rights, to make sure they are implemented, they are respected, whether it's media freedom, whether it's justice independence, whether it's individual rights. And this is something also we are realizing now. It's not a kind of given, it's not an automatic process. It's also something that I think in these countries, you know it well because you fought just a generation ago for independence, for freedom. We are celebrating now the 30th anniversary. I'm very happy to be here on this occasion of our diplomatic relations. So you know what freedom means. You know what fighting for freedom means. And I think it's very important for other countries, including mine, for which this fight is maybe a bit older, for your generation, because it seems quite natural, spontaneous, that we need to fight for these European values, because this European model is really worth it. And we saw it during the crisis, we are seeing it now. A lot of countries envy this model, so we should not think it's here forever. It has to be defended, it has to be protected, it has to be deepened, and this will be the big challenge now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beaune, for very comprehensive expose on the issues that European Union is facing and will be facing in the future. And indeed, it's very interesting, very paradoxical that Europeans want to say more on Europe, want to vote in Europe, but they still don't come to the elections. And that's going to be one of the issues that European Union will have to face, how to bring people to vote. But I've heard three words in your speech. That was solidarity, democracy, and ambition. And I think these are the distinguishing features of European Union. Ambition, maybe it's a bit new one, but very important for the future. And both three things, they are distinguishing features, but they in a way also are challenges for Europe that European Union is facing. Standards of democracy in some countries are getting lower. What European Union has to do about that, then solidarity, is it always working? Some countries would say that not. So here's my question to Mr. Pranckevičius. So facing these three challenges, what European Union has to do to be successful in the future?
Thank you, Margarita. Well, what it always has done, sometimes when I look at the European history, I remember, or I rephrase the phrase of Winston Churchill, that Europe is always going from crisis to crisis without losing enthusiasm. And in fact, rather perhaps more correct would be to say that we are always going from crisis to consolidation, from crisis to mobilization. We have been lucky so far that in the history of European integration, each and single crisis has strengthened us, not weakened us. We're not sure how long this will be, and therefore it's so important to build up the resilience and the possibility to also have prognosis and strategic foresight capability. And here, the work of the academia, the institutes, the think tanks is so important, so that we at least try to predict the tendencies and trends that Europe is better prepared in the future. But if you look at the crisis history in the past, especially the recent ones that we all remember, 2008 global financial crisis, which hit us hard. Afterwards, we've seen, the problems with our banking financial system, and Europe has moved in terms of building the banking union, in terms of creating the permanent bailout funds, in terms of strengthening the Eurozone, in terms of helping Greece in its sovereign debt crisis. 2015, the migration crisis, of course, we're still dealing with the consequences, but again, Frontex was strengthened. The common border border guard has been created. The new pact on migration and asylum is on the table for us to agree and to discuss. Now, as well, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec Clément that the pandemic has not only given the new impetus for the health policy, but has made Europe take steps unprecedented in its history. First, by creating this recovery fund, which never existed in the past, indeed with a very creative joint borrowing system and joint financing of the economic recovery via 750 billion euros, and not only recovery, but the future transformation in terms of green and digital. And also the joint purchase of the vaccine. And not only joint purchase of the vaccine, the joint investment in the manufacturing of the vaccines. If not for the European initiative and the big effort to mobilize the funding and the best minds of this world, we would not have vaccines so quickly. You remember in the beginning, people were saying it will take years to have vaccine. In fact, it took less than a year. And now we're in the business of convincing people to vaccinate. So, there are some of those big historic successes of Europe that sometimes we neglect in our daily stream of information and noise, and sometimes don't give enough credit. You're stuck in this room for an hour with €2 optimism, sorry to say. So we will be definitely reinforcing each other rather than contradicting each other. And I completely agree with Clément. And to answer Margarita's question, what Europe has to do in order to safeguard those values is I think, to focus on the issues that Clément has also mentioned. Naturally, climate crisis, which is the main crisis of this generation, where EU is a leader in terms of 2050 ambition of becoming climate neutral economy, in terms of also convincing other global players to be no less ambitious and forming a global coalition in order to move to a new economic model in terms of changing and transforming our agriculture, transport, energy, and the way we live and the way we consume. Second, of course, digital transformation that Clément also mentioned. This is not just a part of our daily life. It brings us so many opportunities, especially the new technologies, artificial intelligence and big data, which potential is enormous. But it also brings us worries as a free society how to manage it well. Given that today we have a phenomenon of being more interconnected than in the world's history, but at the same time we feel that we are separating from each other in digital bubbles and digital tribes and not communicating with each other anymore, not understanding each other's views anymore, and feeling more and more animosity towards each other. And we see that on different issues, starting from vaccination and ending with many others. So digital tools have to empower people rather than separate them, and it is a major issue for also policymakers in Europe. Third, migration, which might have stopped during COVID-19 era, but let's not be fooled, this will define also the 21st century, not least because of the tragedy in Afghanistan, but overall due to the climate change, due to the ethnic wars and conflicts, and the people, of course, naturally looking for better life, for better survival opportunities, and Europe will always be in the middle of the migration process and debate, and therefore it's so important for us to finally have a common rule book how to deal with it and have a common strategy on both asylum, migration, external border security, secondary movement, legal migration, attracting of the best bright minds in the world, etc. And last and not least, and indeed not least, and here I completely share what Clément has said, the values debate today is not a paper debate, it's a real issue. So the fact that we have seen the retreat of democracy, the fact that we have seen attacks against freedom of press and individual liberties, not only outside of Europe but also in Europe, has to be a reminder of us that if we don't save it, we might not save European Union. Therefore, now more than ever we need to talk about human rights, more than ever we need to talk about rule of law, more than ever we need to talk about equality and non-discrimination.
Thank you, Arnoldo, very much. And indeed, you mentioned several challenges that the European Union will be facing in the nearest future, but not in not so near future: migration, climate change, digitalization. The whole world will be facing it. But you know, for European Union, it's very important to stay relevant. How to achieve this primacy in the world affairs? And again, all these challenges will be posing the challenges in terms of democracy and solidarity and ambition. And I believe this is a very good start to open the floor for the questions from the students. So you are the younger generation, so you will be living in this Europe in turmoil. So what do you feel? What are your thoughts? What are your ideas where the European Union is heading, and what is important for the European Union? What we have to do today to be successful in the future? So do I see the hands being raised? Yes, Umberto.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So first of all, just to thank you for the opportunity and that we're actually using the platform for discussing on the future of Europe. But I must express my worry, first of all, because it's great that we can discuss and debate on the future of Europe in this format. However, I do believe that most of the people here are mostly Euro-optimistic, and we are mostly of the same digital tribe. And I'm also very glad that this was mentioned by both of the speakers, because I tend to usually ask this question when I have the chance, because I do believe it is quite a fundamental one. Currently now, in Europe, we are facing, as has been mentioned, in France, riots. In Lithuania, we have had a great riot and some kerfuffle near the parliament just a couple of weeks ago. And the issue and the question is this. So I would like for you to elaborate, if possible, on what the European Union should do in regards to regulating and creating a system where the algorithms of social media would take into account that the information that we receive would be more diverse and not only bring us only closer into bubbles. Because as we see now, we have a lot of information, but the idea of the Enlightenment that the more you get and the more you know, the better it is, it's actually not. We get a lot of information, but a lot of misinformation also. And first of all, this is the technical part, but in practicality, secondly, just to follow up, what can we personally do in our daily lives, not on social media and not through policy, to bridge the gap and bridge the divide between the progressive or the more social conservative sides, or whatever sides there may be? Thank you.
Thank you, Umberto, and I assume the question goes to both of the speakers. Mr. Beaune.
Well, thank you very much for this. It's true that there is some comfort in discussing in formats in which everyone thinks the same. I don't know, but I assume, as you say, that there is some enthusiasm for Europe in this room, and probably online too. I mean, there's no perfect remedy for that, that's clear. And you are opening different questions. I would go back to disinformation and cyber threats and so on. But first, on the first issue of how we engage people talking about Europe, it's extremely difficult. And I tend to think that there is a space which is never really explored, which is the biggest space, actually, probably in the public opinion, between the people who are convinced about Europe, Euro-optimistic, Euro-enthusiastics, which are a minority, obviously, which is important and positive. I would put myself in this box, but I'm fully aware that it's not enough, and we can talk together. It's probably necessary, but we would not reach out. I also tend to think that, contrary to what is sometimes said, it's true in Lithuania with this high level of support for the EU. I think it's true also in France with probably a lower level of support or trust, but there is a small group of people who are completely anti-EU, meaning that they are saying that everything is EU's responsibility, EU's fault, EU's failure and so on. We had this in France for the vaccination campaign, when I was saying a few months ago on TV, on the radio, look, it's a good decision to take the EU framework, to follow it, to stick to it. A lot of people, including the press, were saying you're totally silly or stupid or naive. It would have been much better to do it our own way, each country buying its doses and so on. Now we see how important it is to have done this, because when you are vaccinated and your neighbor is not, you still have a problem. But it's difficult. But I do think that in the middle, there is a vast majority of the population who just wants to be interested, who just thinks, I think, that Europe is there, that it's a democratic item, a democratic thing, that you just want to be informed about, you just want to think about, you just want to propose ideas about. That's what we are trying to do. Again, I think there's no magic bullet or silver bullet. We're trying to start exactly this in France in the coming weeks by organizing citizens panels which are not made of people who are already convinced, but we draw people randomly in each single region of the country, in each of the 18 regions of France, and we ask them, 50 people per region, to spend 3 days actually, discussing on Europe together, and then they make a public report, but for 3 days they are all together, no press, no politicians, and so on. They come from all backgrounds. We ask them if they are pro, anti, or indifferent to Europe at the beginning. Most of them are indifferent to Europe. And they discuss, and we will see what it's producing. Again, I'm not saying it will just solve everything, but it will be interesting to see, I think, that there is a lot of people who just want to have a say on Europe. They are not fully enthusiastic. They are not part of the European movement, a pro-European party, and whatever. They are not totally crazy about this is Europe's fault, this is all Europe's responsibility. They just want to approach it as a democratic discussion. And this is probably the kind of what we call silent majority in French, silent majority approach that we should try to follow. I was discussing with members of parliament 3 days ago in France, and some of them were telling me, I mean, we follow you in Europe, we think it's important and so on, but when I'm in my constituency, it's very difficult to illustrate what Europe is doing, right or wrong, just what Europe is doing. I said, but go to a vaccination center. I said, but that's nothing to do with EU. Yeah, of course it is. Go to a vaccination center and say this vaccine is European. Of course it's a shortcut, but it's true. And you can demonstrate, I don't go back to my argument on the European framework, that probably, I'm totally convinced about this, if we had gone a fully national way, even in France, even in big country, on a big market, we would be slower than Germany, because they have their own startup producing a vaccine. We don't have yet. And I would be in a very difficult situation as a member of the French government to explain that because we wanted to make a fully national choice, we are lagging behind our neighbor. So go to a vaccination center and say this is a European success. Go to a farm and say half of the financial support you get is coming from EU budget. So it's not only abstract things about European solidarity. I think I will go with Arnoldo this afternoon. It's a very sensitive and hot topic to the border. We have sent some bilateral supports in these difficult moments and crisis, migration crisis. There was a lot, I think, of EU support to make sure, it's not solved yet, unfortunately, but that we are supporting Lithuania in facing this kind of hybrid war organized by Belarus. We have to be very concrete and reactive. I think the biggest problem is that we are too slow and we don't say what Europe is doing. We don't say that the vaccine is about Europe. We don't say that the recovery plans we are all implementing in our countries is about Europe. When I go to a French constituency or region, I say on each billboard saying this is a recovery plan, this is funded by the recovery plan, 40% of this school being renovated, this road being renovated is Europe. We have to do this. Just on this information, don't want to be too long, it's a big challenge not only for Europe, for all democracies. And here again, probably we have been too long, too naive. Probably here you know better than a lot of EU countries because you have a neighbor which is used to to work on this type of disinformation and threats. But it's a long-term fight. Social media will not disappear. It's very easy to organize a campaign to ask bots to spread news. We saw that with a lot of issues, as a so-called Marrakech Pact a few months ago, the vaccine. You know, every time I support the European framework for vaccination on Twitter, I get messages from a Twitter account called Sputnik. So this will last. It will be part of our debates. And sometimes we are too shy or too slow. There is no easy remedy here again. But for instance, we had discussed this before. If we just look at cyber threats, cyber attacks, we have a lot of expertise at the EU level. We have, unfortunately, a lot of knowledge of this. Because here in other EU countries, you have had, or you are facing attacks. We have sometimes the best tech people to reply to this. Why don't we have, when we have a big electoral process in Lithuania, in France, in Germany, a pool of EU experts that go to a country and strengthen the cyber threats or counter-cyber attacks units of all our countries? That could be a very concrete answer. We have done it, for instance, for civil protection in some areas, like fires, like natural disasters. We should do it for cyber threats and for cyber attacks. Here again, we could demonstrate that there is EU support. If there is a pool of experts coming from Estonia, Germany, Belgium to France when there is elections, to make sure we have enough people just monitoring the attacks and responding, identifying them, that would be a concrete benefit from EU. And then on the democratic debate, it's also a cultural and generation challenge. I hope, not being naive or excessively optimistic, that your generation will be more aware of this. Our generation, I think we are pretty much, Arnoldo, the same age. We will not say to students how old we are, but we are not that old in comparison with the society average. But I think for our transition generation regarding tech, regarding social media, probably we are the least equipped, because we are using the social media, but we are still a bit naive, maybe not us, but generally speaking, about the news that you read on Twitter, the pictures you see on Instagram and so on. I think your generation will be better equipped mentally, if I may say, to make sure that when you read something on Twitter or every social media, it's not necessarily true, I hope. And then we will need also public regulations. And I think European regulations to some extent. Don't want to open this very vast debate, but when we saw after the American elections that some Twitter account of the president, still president at that time, Mr. Trump, was suspended. I'm not a big fan of Mr. Trump. I thought there was a reason for that, but it's a problem, I think, when it's a private decision. We should have in our parliament, in the European Parliament, a public debate on when we do that, how we do that, along which criteria, how you can have a public decision, you can oppose a public decision. It has to be publicly defined and debated, not privately and spontaneously organized. This is a new debate as well, because, I mean, Twitter, Instagram, all these big social media you are using every day, and the ones developing still more, TikTok and so on, are new. They are between 2 to 10 years old. So we are still learning how to regulate or how to make the balance between innovation, speed and so on, and public rules. But I'm here also quite optimistic that in the US, in Europe, we will have the same challenges and define these rules in the years to come. And again, I think your generation will be asking for this and more aware of all these threats and how to combat them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beaune. And we're having less than 15 minutes, so I'll pass the word to Mr. Pranckevičius. And I also want to remind that we have students from Sciences Po watching us, and I want to remind that you can reach us on the platform Slido. It's #EuropeFuture. I already have 3 questions, so I'll be posing later on one of the questions, but maybe I'll gather several questions just to save the time. So, Arnoldo.
Just quickly to add, because Clément has really very well and very extensively addressed the question. maybe to address the second part of Umberto's remark about the importance or necessity of regulation or not from the European side, it is a tricky debate. I think we've done a lot already in terms of the good practice code with the big platforms, the GAFA, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. They have improved in the way they track disinfo and, in fact, especially remove, of course, artificial profiles and those that are spreading disinformation, and I think they are constantly improving. And we've seen that also during the vaccination process, where we had a tsunami of disinformation, the infodemic as well as pandemic. But it is a process which should be ongoing, and I think it's a responsibility of the platforms themselves in terms of their reputation and their ability to retain trust of the consumers to pay much more attention to this. Another area where what is very important, I think, is the fact checkers community and the work on the ground. Also, Lithuania is a good example where we have this Debunk EU success story, and it was not a government project; it is a private project, of media organizations with the elves, the famous Lithuanian elves, and also artificial intelligence that managed together, to screen several dozen thousand articles per day, analyze different narratives of disinformation, and provide fact-checking material to the main media outlets of Lithuania, so that you can react quick, you can debunk quick, you can be quick, and it's always much more effective if not the government does it, but the media, industry itself. In terms of regulation, it is important, absolutely, but we have to be careful, how far we go. I think in Europe, the two strongest tools that we have always had in the European Union is competition and diversity. If you have competition of ideas, or have competition in the economy, and if you have diversity of views and diversity of players, you somehow, are successful in reaching out and integrating most of the society. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind when we approach regulation, especially when we approach, for instance, artificial intelligence ethical standards. So not to overdo it, because sometimes we do too much in Europe, and then we get a lot of criticism from the big businesses that that doesn't help innovation, that doesn't help risk taking, that kind of makes us slower in terms of competition vis-a-vis the United States and China, and it should be a very fine balance between the freedom of speech, between the competition of the markets, between the security of privacy data and fight against disinformation, and also the general public interest.
Thank you. Thank you, Arnoldo. We have a question from Sciences Po. Marie asks what's going to be with the ideas expressed in the Conference on the Future of Europe. Is it going to be just another debate, or they will be implemented? But I'll pick a couple of questions. Adam was the first, and second, and third, and fourth. But just one sentence, one question, and then...
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting to listen to this. And I would like to touch upon one of the issues that you already talked about the Afghanistan. What we as a European society can take from the lessons learned from the Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next here, I think it just goes in a row, so we can leave the microphone.
Thank you. And my question would be a follow-up of my colleagues. Having in mind the world is becoming multipolar with global competitors, what the EU should improve as soft power tools to stay relevant and have an edge of our competitors in the 21st century? Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you.
Monsieur le Ministre have mentioned that about cultural changes, and Europe has stood out from ancient times for its distinctive unifying culture. Monsieur Beaune, how will the culture change and what role will it play in the future society, in the future? Merci.
Thank you. And the last, okay, we'll have the last here, but fast, very fast, please, because I know that Minister has to go away. So that was there, over there. Third row. Yep.
I would like to hear your opinion about stepping beyond political democracy and introducing economical democracy in the European Union.
Okay, there are so many questions. We'll see if we have time. So you don't have to answer all of them, but yeah, and here the last one, the last of the last.
I want to ask, don't you think that introducing more rights will reduce their value because it will be difficult to respect them all?
Thank you. Thank you. So we have Conference of Europe, Afghanistan, soft power, values. I think we'll start with Mr. Beaune because you are the guest. We know Arnoldas can come to the Institute and answer to these questions later on.
It's a comprehensive menu. I will try to not to be too long, which is my bad habit. Maybe on the conference on the future of Europe to start with this. It's a gamble in a way. It's a bet because I can understand some skepticism. We have tried sometimes to have debates, open debates, local debates in all EU countries. I think this time it's not a guaranteed success. What we are trying to do for the first time is to have a long moment for debates because it lasts nearly a year in all 27 member states at the same time. It was not planned like this, but it comes after the crisis or the bulk of the crisis. So in a moment where I think people have a willingness to push reforms, to push ideas, to push criticism also as regarding what the EU has been doing and so on. And we will try to do during the French EU presidency starting next January to kind of wrap up the proposals done in the local debates, in the citizens panels at the EU level, in a kind of plenary with members of European Parliament, members of national parliaments and so on, and to propose a roadmap for long-term reform. I think we should not focus on institutions first, because this is a traditional approach. Let's change the treaty, let's reform the institutions. Maybe it will come. Maybe it will be needed in the years to come. But I think you never think in terms of treaty or in terms of institutions. You want solutions about climate, you have questions about values, you have questions about foreign policy, Afghanistan, and so on. So let's try to implement some concrete changes. And it will be first our responsibility as presidency to kind of propose and draft this roadmap with all the member states next spring. So we will try to do our best so that this huge amount of ideas, proposal, contributions will be used not to say that each proposal will be given an answer. It's not possible or not credible, but so that we have 10, 15 points of concrete reforms that we are trying to push in the years to come. Not, of course, only during our presidency, which is only 6 months, but in the years to come. And it's all a matter of political impetus and political will. The more you are taking part in these debates, the more you are contributing to the platform, the more chances, the highest the chances are that this process is leading to reforms. Maybe on the issues you were raising, it could be very long as well, but a few words on Afghanistan and maybe our foreign policy approach, hard on soft power. I think the lesson from Afghanistan, and I say that from a French point of view, should not be that we don't need the transatlantic partnership, we don't need the US and so on. It's clear. I think it just underlines a trend which was there, is that the US will be asking us also, to start with this, to take more responsibility. And when we talk about strategic autonomy, whatever you call it, because I think these debates about words are a bit sometimes silly, open strategic autonomy. On substance, I think we agree much more than we think. We just should be less dependent on the US, which I think is not going against the US, is not thinking we can do without the US, which would not be credible. But when we have, in a situation like Afghanistan, to evacuate people, it's difficult to do it in a coordinated EU manner, it's difficult to do it ourselves. When we talk about strategic autonomy, I think it starts with thinking ourselves about what our interests, priorities. What was extremely striking in this Afghanistan crisis is that, to be frank, most, if not all, allies of the US, all EU countries in particular, most EU countries, did not have their own analysis of the situation. We just followed. And when the US decided to withdraw, we had to do something in a few days, few hours, to react, to evacuate, to save people. We didn't have our own real intelligence, our own strategic thinking about the situation. And this has to change, not again to do in all cases differently from the US or to go against the US. But for instance, in France, we think that Africa, Sahel is a threat or challenge for European security. We are now, a lot of European countries active there. The US will not be present forever, will not support us in this region because they say, okay guys, if you want to be active to protect your own European security against terrorism, against different threats, do it yourself. Invest more in defense, spend more, develop ability to act abroad, to operate abroad. Cybersecurity, very important, of course, we will have to cooperate in the long run with the US to analyze these threats, to fight these threats. But do we really think that we can reasonably ask the US to fund, to support technically 100% of our cybersecurity defense? No. They will say legitimately to us, because the US public will ask for this to its governments. These Europeans, they should spend more, they should develop their expertise, they should react, they should act. So I think we should go beyond the debate about is this the end of the transatlantic partnership, is the end of the US protection. It's not. Is it the end of US power and influence? It's not. But we should complement it by a strengthened, increased European ability to fight the biggest threats we face.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I've been too long.
Thank you.
I will
thank
leave
you,
the
Mr.
other
Beaune.
parts.
I think that, you know, the protocol is very firm, and then they are showing to me that no time is left, you have to run. So, pardon?
Just, yeah.
Yeah, 2 words to Arnoldas, and then...
Well, trying to, in a couple of sentences, to merge the questions, I think Afghanistan indeed might be a very interesting question for political scientists and international relations students to analyze indeed whether the European Union will be able to use its soft power, because, you know, in terms of our capacity of peace building and nation building and consensus seeking, we will need to stay in the region politically and diplomatically, even if we have withdrawn militarily. Secondly, it is a test about the values, you know, how far we will go in terms of working with Taliban, recognizing it or not, how we will condition it on human rights and the rights of women and girls, and you know, this is a test for the whole Western society, and it is indeed a test for the transatlantic unity, whether, you know, we will be taken over by this blame game, or in fact it will help us to renew our partnership and understand that we need each other more than ever in this world, but at the same time that Europe has to invest much more in its own capacity, in its own resilience, and its own capability, you know, when it comes to burden sharing together with NATO and the United States.
Thank you. That was very brief. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'd like to thank you, both of you, Monsieur le Ministre, Arnoldo, and that just shows that, you know, there are so many questions and even more answers. So you have to come back to the Institute one day, and that we could proceed with this discussion and try to answer questions. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. And I hope that we will share this optimism even more in the years about the future of Europe.
Thank you.